Hey, Lecture 6, Chapter 2, second last one. There's going to be 7 lectures, I now see, as I've kind of figured it all out. I also, by the way, figured something else out. It's just kind of funny in how habitual people are. Normally when I'm doing my thing in front of the computer, I'm having a video meeting, and so therefore I have headphones on to hear the other side. I just now realized that when I'm recording these lectures, there is no other side. It's just me. And so... Hey, I shed my headphones, which is great. I get to do this without headphones now. I like it a lot better. So, very cool. Here we are. Let's just jump in. And this is really what, I've been waiting for, or whatever. This is the star of Chapter 2, as it were, and what everything in Chapter 2 is leading to. Experiments. When we talk about some discipline being a science, we use that word really kind of loosely. So we'll talk about things like political science and computer science. I don't think political science is a science. I don't think computer science is a science. What makes something a science? Experiments, testing hypotheses through experimentation. It's a big difference. And it goes back to that difference between philosophy and psychology. Without the experiments, ideas and theories are just ideas and theories, and you have no idea which ones to believe and which ones to not believe. That's what experiments are for. They are opportunities to explicitly test your hypotheses and to see how good they are at predicting. And that will be the basis of experimentation, is using some hypothesis and using a theory to begin with to produce a hypothesis that you can now test with an experiment and, often find that your current idea is just wrong. That's how science progresses, by finding out the bad ideas and weeding them out. What's left are our current theories about things. And that's how we progress. Okay, so let's jump into it. Move on. So this is the real, why such a big deal about experiments, and why do we talk about it so much? Well, because of this distinction between what, if you want to know what is out there, we've talked about all the opportunities, right? Observational research, case studies, surveys, even down to correlations. They are all just telling you what is out there. Okay. If you want to know how that came to be or why that came to be, if you're really interested in a more functional, dare I say, approach of understanding what you're seeing, that's all about what we call causation. And again, causation is what it sounds like. We're trying to get at what is causing things to happen. That's ultimately what science is about, is trying to understand why things happen the way they do. And only experiments can take you there. Or at least only experiment. You can have theories about why, but experiments are what tell us which theories to believe. Okay. So you've seen variants of this before, but we're now finally going to embrace this in a full way. So really, to a large extent, we've been just living up here in this chapter so far, through observations of behavior, or sometimes observations of relationships between variables, correlations. We start to think about things. It makes us ask questions. Like, for example, if we go back to the, tall people make more money, you start to say, well, why? I'd like to know what's going on there. What's actually making that relationship happen? And so you start thinking of questions. Why does this specific pattern occur? And that should lead you to, so there's a missing link here, by the way, that I will talk about. Why does this pattern occur? When you start to have answers to that in your mind, sort of connecting these two, you start to have a theory. And from that theory, you generate a hypothesis. I'm going to spend a bit of time talking about that distinction on the next slide, but I want to be very clear about this. You start by seeing stuff. You start thinking, why does that happen? And as you start to think you have an idea, that idea is your theory. And you can now take that theory and say, okay, if that theory is right, can I think of a very specific prediction that theory makes? That's your hypothesis. And now what you want to do is test that prediction. You want to create, you have this testable prediction, and you want to create an experiment that will allow you to put that prediction to the test. And either that experiment confirms what you believe, in which case, hey, you might want to start generalizing your theory. Your theory has potential, right? Maybe it accounts for other things as well. Maybe you want to make other predictions with that theory and see if it continues to be successful. Or if it isn't successful, then you have to refine, alter, expand, or reject your hypothesis. You have to change your theory, and that will change the hypothesis, right? So the hypothesis was not held up, that prediction, that's what we're going to call the hypothesis, it was not held up. So something about our thinking is wrong. So we have to revisit our thinking and either reshape our theory and generate a new hypothesis, or we have to abandon the theory altogether, perhaps. Etc. This is the really important, this part in the middle is how science progresses. We progress on the basis of failed predictions. We don't appreciate the power of failure in our life in general. Failure is what leads to learning, right? First of all, failure reflects attempts. You can only fail at something if you try in the first place. So if you failed at something, good on you for trying. Okay, first of all. And then secondly, did you learn from that failure? Science is all about formally learning from failures to predict. And we take those failures seriously and we use them to shape our theories and make them more accurate. Okay. Let's go through this with a solid example that will allow me, when we talk about experiments, there are a number of terms that come up that you have to become familiar with. And I could define these terms in an abstract way, a general way, but it's often a lot easier to understand them and think about them if we create a very concrete, specific context. And so let's do that. Let's take an issue that affects us all, some more than others, and that's prejudice. There's a number of people who've kind of looked at, let me start here. When I was young, I was extremely naive. We would grow up and we would hear about things like the race riots in Los Angeles and especially, of course, the 60s. Everything that was going on around race in America in the 60s. We heard about a lot of things, and I naively thought prejudice was something from the past, something that we used to engage in, but we have learned better. And at some point I learned, no. Prejudice has always been there. It probably always will be there. And it gets stronger and weaker over time. And if you, in fact, look at history of prejudice, so to speak, you see times when society has been very prejudicial. I mean, societies, right? We're going to have to talk about specific geographic regions and what's going on. But there's times when feelings of prejudice become really, really strong, and then other times when they kind of weaken. And so, okay, well, that sucks, first of all, that we're not just getting rid of it. But if we do want to reach a better place as human beings, a place where we're less prejudicial, we would like to understand what's driving prejudice, what makes people prejudice. This is what's putting us in the experimental domain, right? When we want to understand causes, then we need to do experiments. And so, some people who've looked at the history noticed this, what's being suggested in this slide, that if you tie how prejudicial a given context is, let's say a nation, just to make it easier, and you look at how prejudicial it is, and you look at the economy, what you see is what looks like a relationship, a correlation. And let me phrase it, and you in your head decide if this is a negative correlation or a positive correlation. The worse the economy is, the lower the economy is, the more prejudice we tend to see, more prejudicial kind of behavior. What is that? Negative or positive? So that's a negative correlation, right? As the economy goes down, prejudice goes up. So that's a negative correlation. They're going different directions. And so this starts to, this brings you to the question of why, right? Okay, I see that correlation. Why? And a theory kind of goes like this. This is one theory that's out there, that it all has to do with self-esteem. really. And so the idea is just this: if we have a country, let's say, and every country is mixed of people who kind of think they are natives of that country, even though they're sometimes often mistaken, and more recent immigrants to that country. And the claim is, when the economy's bad and when people start losing their jobs, they start feeling really bad about themselves. Imagine you're somebody that was able to provide for your family and things were doing well, but now you've been laid off. You can't find another job. You're not bringing in enough money. Suddenly you have to look for like worse housing for your family maybe, or what, and you feel like a loser. You feel like a failure. And the claim is, when people feel that way, there's a little bit of anger, a little bit of resentment that life has put them in this situation, and that they will vent that, and especially will vent it at what we're going to call out groups, people outside of their normal group of people they interact with, whatever that might be. And so often that means it's these latest newcomers, the latest immigrants, whoever they may be, that become the target of anger. And in fact, sometimes you will hear things like, they've come here and taken our jobs, right? And so that sort of notion, it's sort of a blaming of the outgroup, blaming of the others. And so that's a theory. That's how it happens, okay? So first of all, let's just talk about that in a general sense. That is a general theory that when things get bad for somebody, when their self-esteem gets low, then they're more likely to be prejudicial to others. We're talking about the economy being one thing that can do that, but the more general theory we have here is that people will behave more prejudicially when their self-esteem is low. That's a theory. And it's partly, here I say, people become more scared of others when they're feeling personally weaker or insecure. That's another way of thinking about it. So are they venting anger, or are they actually, we always feel intimidated by people we don't understand as well. And so out groups, those groups of people we don't hang out with, we don't know them very well. We don't know how they'll respond to things because we haven't had a lot of experience. And so there's always a bit of fear. There's always a bit of fear around outgroups. I think I like the previous way I stated this theory better than this way. So I want to go back to that previous way. I want to go back to the theory that anytime somebody is feeling weak, insecure, low self-esteem, they're more likely to be prejudicial. Maybe because they're scared of others. Maybe because they're venting their anger. That's okay. We don't really have to get to that level of detail. We can just say, when self-esteem is low, we expect more prejudicial behavior. Okay. So the thing I want to stress about that is that's a very general statement. And where we want to go from that general statement is to a very specific prediction. And that's what we're going to call the hypothesis. So any theory could give rise to a bunch of different hypotheses, right? A bunch of different predictions that come from that theory. Here's one. People with lower self-esteem should behave in more prejudicial ways than people with higher self-esteem. So, that just follows. So from that theory, if somehow we could identify groups of people that were low self-esteem and groups of people that were high self-esteem, well, then we expect the low self-esteem to be more prejudicial. Now, wow. Cool. How do we test this hypothesis? So we now reach a point when we're thinking about experiments where we have to start coming up with what we're going to call operational definitions. So higher or lower self-esteem is one of the things we're talking about. Prejudice is another thing we're talking about. If we want to get to an experiment, we have to come up with very specific and concrete ways of testing this hypothesis. And that means we have to say, here's how we're going to create groups of low and high self-esteem people, or here's how we're going to find those groups, let's say, and here's how we're going to measure prejudice. And that step is critical. Like when a reviewer is reviewing a scientific paper, they're looking very carefully at how you get from the theory to the hypothesis to the specific experiment that you ran. Okay, so let's start to go to a specific experiment to take this apart. So first of all, just to make that claim again, just that negative correlation is not enough to show that our theory is right. It's consistent with our theory. So if we just measured people's self-esteem, and if we could somehow measure their prejudicial behavior, I'll come back to that. And if we found a negative correlation, the lower the self-esteem, the more prejudicial behavior, that would fit with our theory, okay? But it would fit with a lot of other things too, okay? It could be, if you're a prejudicial person, people react to you negatively, and that reduces your self-esteem. So maybe it's your prejudicial behavior that's causing your low self-esteem, not the opposite. Or maybe there's a third variable that's affecting both of those things. So maybe, like we talked about for height, maybe this is all about socioeconomic status, how much money you have access to. Maybe people with less money are more prejudicial and have lower self-esteem. Maybe. So the point being, a correlation will not give us the sort of evidence that we want. We have to go to an experiment. All right. So in a general sense, I'm going to ease to the actual experiment. So if we start with that hypothesis, and let's say we have a bunch of normal people, and via random selection, we're going to vary their self-esteem. So let me just talk about why we're doing it this way, first of all. You might imagine, hey, let's just measure self-esteem, and let's find a bunch of people who have high self-esteem and find a bunch of other people who have low self-esteem, and let's measure their prejudicial behavior and see if the theory holds up. The problem is, if you find people that already have high or low self-esteem, there might be other reasons why they have their high or low self-esteem. That is, there might be a bunch of ways in which these groups are different. Yes, they're different in terms of their self-esteem, but they might be different, for example, in terms of academic ability. Maybe the high self-esteem people have higher grades than the other ones. They may be different. I mentioned socioeconomic status, maybe the amount of nutrition they have access. Goodness knows. If you take pre-existing groups, then you're always worried they're different the way you want, but how else are they different? Because any difference between them could cause them to behave differently. So what we would rather do is create groups where the only difference, as far as we assume, is that one has higher self-esteem and one has low. Okay. Now, I hope in your mind you're thinking, how? How is the operational definition? We're going to get there. So let me stay general. So what we would like to do is we'd like to start with a group of people and then randomly assign them to these two groups. Why random? This is very important, the random assignment to the different groups. That is what assures us that those groups are not different in any other way, right? So if we put all the men in one group and all the women in another group, well, those groups are different in terms of gender as well as anything we do to them, right? If we put all the old people in one group and all the young, they're going to be different. But if we just randomly put people in these two groups, then any variable we could think of, age, height, weight, gender, so the variables we can imagine, but also the variables that we're not even thinking about, there should not be any systematic difference in those variables. So we shouldn't end up with more men in one group, or more old people in one group, or more people who've slept well in one group. If you're randomly assigning, then those poor sleepers should be just as likely to be in group 1 as group 2. And after you assign people, you'd probably have just as many in group 1 as group 2. So random assignment we use to try to make those groups equal. So at the time of random assignment, we think these are two subgroups of that larger group, but we assume, because we were using random assignment, that they represent this group. They are like just mini versions of that same group. And for now, they should be very similar to each other, not different in any systematic way, until we do something to make them different. Okay? So then we are going to do something to make them different. We're going to do something to try to create a high self-esteem group and a low self-esteem group. What? We'll get there. And then we want to measure their prejudice. And we would like to see, does this group, low self-esteem, show more prejudicial behavior than this group, high? All right. So that's the general sense of how we're going to test the prediction. Now we really come to the operational definitions. What are we going to do? And how are we going to measure prejudice? Okay, so this is where we have to get specific. So let me tell you, this is an experiment that's been done repeatedly, and it's a good example of one to, I think, get you thinking through a number of issues that we'll be talking about here. So I have to explain to you how it worked. This is the context. Imagine you are a participant in this experiment, and you're there, and let's say it's supposed to start at 9, but then they don't come out and get you till about 10 after 9. So you've been sitting there and waiting 10 minutes, and the experimenter looks a little frazzled when they come and see you, and they say, "Oh man, I'm sorry, I'm running a little late. I've got this hugely important presentation to do this afternoon. It's for my PhD, and it really has to go well, or I don't even know. I could get kicked out of the program. I don't know. So I really have to nail it. So I've been working on this presentation." Now, this experiment was done back when they had slide projectors. And I don't know if you guys have seen slides, but they're the little square things like this that you would load into a carousel, and you would turn that carousel to show the slides. And so what this person says, when you come, they sit at a table and they say, "Yeah, these are my slides. I had to get them all in the right order. And that's what it was taking me so long. I'm sorry, but I had to reorder all of these, and it takes a long time to do that. But anyway, okay, I'm sorry. I'm sorry to bother you with all that. Let's do this experiment." And so they ask you to sit at the table, and at the beginning of the experiment you have to fill out some forms, like consent forms, various other things. Just as you finish doing that, the experimenter sneakily has this little way of knocking over all of those slides. Okay, very sort of surreptitiously. So they have a little thing under the table that they can sort of touch, and the slides fall over onto the floor everywhere. And the experimenter then looks at you and says, "I can't believe you just did that. Oh my goodness. All that work I did, I can't believe you did that. Oh man. Okay. Okay. Let's just get on with the experiment. Let's go ahead. Let's do the next part. So please go into this next room. You're going to watch a little video about something, and we're going to ask you some questions about it." Okay. So first of all, let me be clear. This didn't happen for all the participants. There were 2 groups. Okay. The first group, everything happened the same, but the experimenter did not knock over the slides. And so the person just filled out the paperwork and then went and watched that film and answered the survey. I'll tell you more about that in a moment. So there's only one group, half of the subjects, where the experimenter knocks over the slides and blames the participant, looks at them and goes, "Oh my goodness, how could you have done that? Do you know the work you've caused me?" So the idea here is that this will make these guys feel like losers, that it'll make them feel low self-esteem, like, "Oh my goodness, I just caused a bunch of work. I feel so bad." And so when you've created, so that's, okay, so let me just stop right there. So the claim is this is going to create a group that has their normal self-esteem, whatever it is, but these ones, we have found a way to reduce their self-esteem right now. Okay. Do you believe that? Do you believe this will work? This is a question every reviewer asks, because every experimenter has to come up with some way of manipulating the independent variable. And let's talk about that right now. This is the independent variable. The independent variable is the variable that the experimenter manipulates in the experiment. And so for half the people, they don't knock over the slides. For half the people, they do. And so we're looking at the effect of that. Theoretically, that's going to reduce self-esteem. But again, one question always when we think about an experiment is, do we believe that? Is that really what's going on? Well, let's keep that in mind. Okay, so we're going to keep that in mind. Now, we of course want to know what effect, if any, doing this has on prejudice. How are we going to measure prejudice? Prejudice is known as a very difficult thing to measure because we're not open about our prejudicial tendencies. In fact, some people claim we don't even really know. We're not conscious. We're not aware always of all of our prejudicial tendencies. Some of them may come from a very deeper part of us that we're not even really aware of. So how do you measure something as complex as prejudice? That's a story in and of itself, and I could tell you some of the fascinating ways people have done that. This study took a very simple approach. So what happened was, after filling out the forms and being in one of these groups, the participants watched a video about French Canadians, French Canadian culture, and then they answered a survey. And the survey included a bunch of questions that were negative stereotypes related to French Canadians. And it was an explicit survey, and people went through and answered the questions. How much did they agree with certain claims? And what we're looking at is how much does a participant agree with claims that have that negative stereotype, that sort of prejudicial flavor to them. And specifically, does this group endorse those claims more than this group? Right? The group that we knocked over the slides. If we reduce their self-esteem, are they more likely to endorse prejudicial statements? Does this affect self-esteem? Is this a good way to measure prejudice? Those are core questions for evaluating the experiment. Okay? And we're going to call that internal validity. How good is the experiment? And often, again, a lot of that has to do with the details of the procedure, how you did things, but especially the operational definitions you used. Let's just take a second to unpack this word, operational definitions. The idea here is we want low self-esteem, and high self-esteem. Operational means, what are you actually going to do? When you operate, you're doing something. What are you actually going to do to make that happen? And that's what we mean by our operational definitions. Oh, you think it's going to have an effect on prejudice? Well, what are you actually going to do to measure prejudice? And so operational definitions are going from that sort of theoretical hypothesis, if we had low self-esteem, we should see more prejudice. That's a sort of vague general, to a very specific, here's how we're going to test that in an experiment. And often you would have multiple experiments that test that same hypothesis in different ways. Different ways of manipulating self-esteem, different ways of measuring prejudice. And if you get the same finding, even though you assessed it in very different ways, then you really start to feel confident in what you're doing. Okay, so you get the sense here of an experiment. So just to think critically about this a little bit, and that experiment allowed us to already throw some of the terms out. Let me be clear about one more term over here. Sorry, I talked about this being the independent variable, the variable that you manipulated. This we call the dependent variable. And if it helps, the dependent variable is always the variable that you're measuring. It's the one you want to see if the independent variable has an effect on the dependent variable. So one way to keep that straight is to say, well, does this depend on this? Right? And that's really what we're asking. Does the prejudicial attitudes we see depend on which group students were in, which level of the independent variable? There's another term. Let me use that term for you, level. So when we have a variable like this that we think is going to manipulate self-esteem, an independent variable, we talk about how many levels that we've tested. We're testing 2 levels here. So our independent variable has 2 levels, one where the students don't knock over the slides, one where they do and they're blamed. Okay. The dependent variable is just a survey where we're measuring endorsement of these attitudes. Okay, just want to be clear about some of that stuff. So, yeah. So imagine now, you've done an experiment. We'll talk about the stats in a bit. You've done the statistics. You've written up the whole experiment in a nice manuscript. You submitted it to a journal. That journal, it goes to an editor. That editor picks at least 3 other people who are also experts in this area. 3 other professors at 3 other institutions, sends them your paper and basically says, tell us why we shouldn't publish this. That's sort of what the attitude is. So reviewers look at the paper and they're looking for flaws. This is why I say thinking critically. They're looking for reasons why we shouldn't trust what these authors have to say. And they look at a few different levels. So the first is internal validity. Did they do a good experiment? Like, let's forget about what the experiment might mean for now, to life in general. Let's just look at the experiment. Did they have enough trials? Did they use good operational definitions? Are there potential confounds? So I didn't mention a confound, but a confound, well, I kind of did, but I didn't use that word. So a confound is present when your two groups, or your multiple groups, when the levels of your independent variable, you design your independent variable and the levels of it to only differ in one way, right? We hope that the only difference between our two groups is that self-esteem effect caused by knocking over the slides. If it turns out we find out there's some other difference as well, then there's a potential confound. And let me give you an example of this, and it'll really kind of give you a sense of why random selection is so important. There was a famous example of a graduate student, well, famous for me anyway, at University of Waterloo when I was there at the same time. He was a single guy, and he was always interested in potentially meeting potential dates. And so he was doing a study in which for half of the participants, he stayed in the room with them while they did the experiment. And for half, he did not. And the question really was, does the presence of the experimenter matter? Almost Hawthorne effect-y, right? What he should have done is randomly decided which participants he stayed in the room with and which he did not. But he did not do that. He instead decided he was going to be in the room with all the attractive women. This got found out. I mean, obviously he was a little creepy in his approach to all of this. He got found out and he got in a lot of trouble. He got in a lot of trouble for the reasons you'd expect, but also from an experimental reason. What he now did is he created a situation where one group had him in the room and one didn't, but those groups were different in another way too. More women were in the group where he was in the room. And when you kind of combine this with the fact that he was probably being a little creepy at the time too, those women might have felt uncomfortable in the room. So now any difference you see, is it a function of him being present or not? Or is it a much more complicated thing about, well, but there's more women in that group as well, and maybe the women behave differently, and heck, those women might have felt kind of weird when they're... And so that becomes a confound, okay? And suddenly we don't know what your results reflect anymore. And so reviewers look and they want to make sure, okay, you've really defined your levels well. I believe that the only thing different about those groups is the thing that you're studying. You want to convince them of that. And you want to convince them you're measuring things well. Operationally manipulating things well on the independent variable side, but on the dependent variable side, that you can trust that measure that you used. And, that survey of prejudicial attitudes, we might be a little suspicious about that. And in a lot of research on prejudice, that's a core question. How can we measure it accurately? And so the better you can measure it, the more you can please the reviewers that are looking at it. If they think the experiment's all been well designed and well analyzed and everything falls through, and again, highlight the role of peer review. So many, what's really frustrating with the anti-vaxxer kind of, I did my own research kind of stuff, is very often the data they choose is data that somebody just taught. I did an experiment once and we showed that these vaccines had this horrible effect. Where is that experiment? Oh, we didn't publish it. Why didn't you publish it? Probably because it was a bad experiment and it would never get published. But they're perfectly out there, perfectly comfortable out there talking about it and making big claims about it. This is one of the things scientists agree on. Tell me about data that has been through the peer review process, because then I know 3 experts have really made sure this data is worth thinking about. And that's what real science is about, real research. And that means you have to understand, you have to be able to go to real journals and understand what they say. You're going to get some practice doing that in this course. So this is so critical, that role of peer review. It really helps us ensure that the data that's out there is trustworthy. Okay. Now, once we think the experiment was done well, then we sometimes think, okay, but how well does it relate to the real world, or even the theory you were actually suggesting? Okay, and this is when we really get into the validity of the operational definition, especially around the independent variable, but both. So remember, I said, do you believe that knocking over the slides thing reduced somebody's self-esteem? That's the critical notion from that theory. That's what it says. But what if something else happened? So let me give you another example. What if the participants were smarter than portrayed? And what if many of them knew that the experimenter knocked over the slides? They didn't. They could tell somehow, I didn't do it. It wasn't me. And so now what are they doing? Like, oh, this dude or dudette, whoever it is accusing me of doing something I didn't do. That might make me angry. Okay? And so now maybe I'm going and watching that film of French Canadians, not feeling stupid or like a loser, not the low self-esteem, but rather I'm watching it angry. And now I get asked some questions that include some negative stereotypes of an outgroup for me. And maybe I'm venting my anger on them by being more prejudicial. And so, maybe I've got an experiment that certainly is showing something. That manipulation I did produced some effect on prejudice, but was it really a manipulation of self-esteem? And so that's where somebody, a reviewer, again, a peer reviewer might say, I don't think so. I think there's other alternatives that you have to show me some other data, some more data to make me really believe that you are affecting self-esteem in some way or not. And so we actually do things like replication here. So it's really nice if somebody else says, okay, I understand the way you did self-esteem. I'm going to do it a different way. And there are different ways, by the way. Here's another way. It's nasty. but I'll tell you, you're getting a little bit of the role of deception in psychology. And it doesn't happen that often, but for these ones it happens. So I'll tell you the story. So the other one is we ask people come in and do a bit of a math test before at the beginning of the experiment. They go and they do a bit of a math test. And then the experimenter scores it before the next step. And the experimenter says one of two things. In one condition, they say, oh, wow. This is good. You did really good on this. I think this is the best performance I've seen of all the participants. Wow, very cool. Well done. Okay, now let's go to the next part of the study. Or the experimenter scores it, looks at it, and goes, oof, math's not your thing, is it? Wow, this is okay. Sort of on the lower side of the participants I've seen, but fine, cool, all good. Let's go to the next part of the experiment. So the idea being, they either made you feel really good about your performance, or they made you feel bad about your performance. And this could be another way of manipulating self-esteem. So let's say somebody else, or even the same experimenters, do another experiment where they manipulate self-esteem in a different way, perhaps using that math test, and maybe they measure prejudice in a different way as well. And if they still find the same pattern, that is what we call a replication. Replication with slight extension, we might call that. And the extension meaning, well, they didn't do exactly what they did before. They changed some things a little bit, but they got the same pattern. The more we see different people getting the same pattern using different operational definitions, ways of manipulating the core construct and ways of measuring what you're trying to measure, then the more we start to believe that theory. Okay. The other thing we can do is manipulation checks. At in that first slide experiment, we could just ask people at the end, how did you feel? Did you believe that I knocked over the slides? And how did that make you feel? And we can check, are they feeling angry? Are they feeling low self-esteem? So there are times you literally want to report data that says, yeah, this worked the way I thought. And therefore you can believe the impact to that general theory, which is a general theory about the real world. Okay. This is something that's really kind of important and a failing of most psychological research. When we do an experiment, sometimes we're really only looking at a small group of people that often is not representative of humanity. So psychology is about understanding humans. But we don't do an experiment where we test all humans. That would be impossible. So we have to test a smaller group of humans. But what is the group we use? Well, as you're learning in this class, you guys you are the group we use. We use students who come into our intro psych classes. They tend to be the participants in our experiments. And in fact, in a lot of psychology, it was students in intro psych classes in North America. A lot of the data that you're going to learn about. Now, of course, North America has become much more multicultural in the last couple decades, but a lot of the research you're going to read about happened before the last couple decades. So what you're really learning mostly about is white students who are around 18, 19, 20 years old, who are smart enough to get into university and who are taking an intro psych course. They are not representative of humanity in general. They are, they are a very specific group. I mean, just the fact that they got into university means their intelligence is about 10 points higher than the average human being, at least. That's all of you guys. Congratulations. That limits our conclusions, especially in situations where culture matters. You may find yourself reading about some study where they say, hey, this is how humans behave. And you might go, yeah, I don't think so. That's not how the humans I know behave. That's not how humans from my culture would behave. And it could be a cultural difference. It could be the fact, and there's a whole area of psychology called cross-cultural psychology where they study those cultural differences. And so, when you're having those suspicions, what you're really saying is, I don't think they used a representative sample. So a representative sample is a sample where all of the characteristics that are in we use the word population, the full group we're interested in, which in this case would be humanity. All the various characteristics of humanity are represented in this sample. So, the different ages, perhaps, the different cultural backgrounds, the different racial backgrounds, the different religious beliefs, whatever you can think of, how much they like country music, whatever sort of true of humanity in general, we have a mini version of that. Our sample contains all of that variability as well. If that's true, if we could get a really good representative sample, then everything we find out about that sample, we could probably generalize to all of humanity. But very often our samples are not as representative as we would like. And therefore we have to be careful about what we can generalize to. Is this really just data about young people? Is this really just data about, North American descent? It sounds funny, North American descent, because everyone in North America is from somewhere else. So I don't know, that's sort of weird. But anyway, you get the idea. So representative samples become really important for getting this cultural validity as well. Okay, cool. Have we gone through it all? Sorry. How do you get a representative sample? Well, you try your best to randomly select from that population. It's harder to do than you'd think. So when people do polls, political polls, stuff like that, they try to get these random representative samples. Often people use samples of convenience. That's what we call them. And that's what we do at universities. You guys are here. We can make it part of your course. You're willing to participate. That makes it really convenient for us to get a lot of data. And so we go with the convenience, but we lose some representativeness, which is tricky. If we could do the best thing possible, every human being would have a number, and we would randomly draw numbers, and those humans would be in our experiment. Then we would probably have a pretty good representative sample. But it would be awful hard to do the research, right? Okay, cool. So is that it? Yeah. Okay. So those are the points I wanted to talk to you about. I hope you start to get the idea. Experiments are fun, by the way. One of the things I like to tell students is when you really get into research, experimental research, it's like detective work without all the blood and bodies, right? You run some experiment and you get data, and the data is like the scene of the crime, right? You see the data and you're like, why did the data turn out that way? But there's clues in the data. If you look at it carefully enough, there's certain clues that tell you what's going on, and you use that to develop a theory, much like a detective would. But unlike a detective, you can then take it the next step and say, okay, does this theory make a prediction? Can I test that prediction and see if it holds up? And you're constantly chasing the data, trying to understand it, forming theories, generating predictions, and then testing, like, did it work? Have I got it figured out yet? It's a fun thing, especially if you find the area of research you're working in really intrinsically interesting, something you would like to learn a lot more about. And that's what I tell, by the way, students, when you start thinking about maybe wanting to do research, step one, get to know the research professors are doing here. And use Google Scholar. Google Scholar, type in their name, find out what your professors do research-wise. And if you're thinking you want to approach somebody to do research with them, and again, that's usually more around second or third year, more like third year. But if you want to approach somebody, lead by saying, hey, I am really interested in the research you're doing, and I would love to be involved in learning more about that thing, whatever it may be. If you find something you really want to learn more about, then research is fun. You're learning and you're doing it in a very creative way. You're problem solving, and then you got this surprise of the data when you do the data analysis. It can be a heck of a lot of fun. Okay, cool. I'm going to leave it there. I hope you have a sense of the importance of experiments. We're going to go to a next section, which is, many students are like, which is the statistics part. The statistics comes sort of after, right? When we've done the manipulation, we've run people through the study, we have their data. Now, how do we use that data to figure out what happened? That's what statistics allows us to do, and that's why it's so critical. We'll start that story next.